The African American civil rights movement became a prominent subject throughout America by the 1950s. Although the exact start of the movement is debatable, most events that led to freedom from oppression began in the 50s. Throughout the 30s, activism grew tremendously. During this time, African Americans set a base or a foundation for what was to come. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt came up with the New Deal. While some African Americans praised him, others felt neglected because parts of his deal favored only whites. Many African Americans lost their jobs, and some even lost their homes. He granted more than 100 black people positions in the government, though, which at the time was a pretty huge deal. One can say that he wanted their voices heard as well. Although he didn't totally work in favor of the black community, mostly because of his fear of the white Democrats, he did help. His wife, Eleanor, supported this group of people as well. Given her status, she was a well-known advocate for Afro-Americans and stood up to those who mistreated them. After Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman became president. This was after World War II, and in this time, many African Americans faced racial violence in the South. A resentment built up in their community because those who had served in the armed forces during the war felt it was unfair. They demanded their rights as citizens. Truman supported civil rights and was willing to risk his re-election. He was dedicated to put an end to racial segregation. Even when Congress failed to back his ideas, he took things into his own hands. And in 1948, he issued an executive order for integration of the armed forces. It said, "It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin." World War II helped pave the way of equality for African Americans. The shortage of men called for job opportunities for Latinos, white women, and Afro-Americans. Almost 1 million Afro-Americans served in the armed forces. During the war, civil rights organizations campaigned for voting rights and went against Jim Crow laws. Because of this, Roosevelt issued a directive prohibiting racial discrimination by federal agencies and all companies connected to war work. Black men came back from war even more determined to end racial discrimination at home now that they had defeated their enemies. A monumental event that happened around that time, which is the late 1940s, was the addition of Jackie Robinson to the Brooklyn Dodgers. This broke a huge color barrier in Major League baseball. Although some were not pleased, Robinson won the hearts of many Americans. As previously stated, the 1950s were the time period the beginning of the time period when the civil rights movement boomed. It all started off in 1954 with the Supreme Court's decision on the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka that disputed whether schools should be racially integrated or not. Reverend Oliver Brown sued the Board of Education because he lived next to an all-white school, yet his daughter was not allowed to attend, so she had to take a long bus ride to her all-black school, which was all the way across town. The court ruled in favor of Brown, surprisingly, saying that segregated schools were, quote, inherently unequal and unconstitutional. Still, many schools remained segregated, but a majority were forced to open their doors to everyone, no matter race or color. This paved the way for millions of African Americans. Although originally the case was around schooling, it implied that racial segregation was unconstitutional no matter where. 4 days after the Brown decision, Joanne Robinson wrote a letter to the mayor of Montgomery asking that bus drivers no longer be allowed to force riders in the colored sections to give up their seats to white people. About a year after that came the historical Rosa Parks. On December 1st, 1955, Parks, a seamstress at the time, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. Evidently, she was arrested, but with her conviction came the Montgomery bus boycott. Rumors about her arrest quickly spread, and once Robinson heard about this, she joined forces with E.D. Nixon, who was the leader of the NAACP, and suggested a bus boycott. Many ministers and African American leaders took part in the Montgomery Improvement Association to organize the boycott. This is when Martin Luther King Jr. was chosen to lead the association. On December 5th, the day of the boycott, he gave an empowering speech in front of 5,000 to 15,000 people. This speech fired up the African Americans and gave them a spirit of determination. For 381 days, all African Americans refused to ride buses in Montgomery. They had to support each other and find other means of transportation. They received aid from kind people. In the Black community, people donated 1/5 of their salaries, and so did the NAACP, United Auto Workers, and the Jewish community, and also kind white Southerners. The time lost and the struggles they faced paid off when bus segregation was outlawed in 1956 by the Supreme Court. A little while after that, in January of 1957, Martin Luther King Jr., along with 60 other men, met in Atlanta to form a new group, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They wanted to establish this to carry on nonviolent crusades against the evils of second-class citizenship. King was the president of this organization, and with the help of local churches, they organized peaceful protests and demonstrations. The SCLC was promoted by Ella Baker, who was a granddaughter of slaves. She was also part of the NAACP and used her contacts to set up multiple branches of the SCLC in southern states. The SCLC continued to advocate for racial equality and coordinate nonviolent protests against discrimination and segregation. The first southern state to admit African American students was Arkansas. On September 4th, 1957, 9 Black students attended their first day of school at Little Rock Central High School. Some people agreed with this decision and wanted to desegregate schools. Others strongly opposed. Governor Faubus strongly disagreed and showed his support for segregated schools by ordering the National Guard to turn away the Little Rock Nine. He literally had them stand in front of the school just so they wouldn't get in. The Little Rock Nine, by the way, were the 9 African American students who were admitted into the school. A federal judge then ordered for Faubus to let them into the school. The NAACP arranged for 8 students to be driven to school but could not reach the 9th one since she didn't have a phone. Elizabeth Eckford walked to school alone. She faced an abusive crowd. This caught nationwide attention, and Eisenhower was forced to do something. He ordered 1,000 paratroopers into Little Rock. The 9 African American students were under the watch of these soldiers. Still, they were harassed regularly at school. At the end of the year, Governor Faubus shut down the school because he didn't want integration to continue. On September 9, 1957, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The law gave the Attorney General greater power over school desegregation and gave the federal government authority over violations of African American voting rights. Even though more schools opened up their doors to the African American community, some failed to recognize them. On February 1, 1960, 4 students from the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina were not served lunch at an all-white counter. They began a sit-in and refused to leave until they were served lunch. Their nonviolent means of protest caused a wave of harassment. White segregationists who attended the school would pour food over them, beat them, and jeer at them. These Black students just sat there and faced these humiliating acts. They remained seated until closing and came back the next day to do the same thing with 20 more African American students. Over the next week or so, the number of sit-ins around town and even around the South grew. Every single seat was filled, and they spilled out of the store. More and more sit-ins happened throughout the South. The media covered every single bit. Protesters were arrested, yet more kept coming, filling in the seats of those who were taken. Store managers called the police, raised prices of food, and removed the counter seats, all to prevent it. But this didn't stop the movement. At this point, it even spread to the North. In April of 1960, a new group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC for short, SNCC, arose. They were backed by the NAACP and organized nonviolent protests. It created a place for the young African American activists in the civil rights movement. After months of peaceful protests, facilities began to desegregate everywhere. the 4 American students who started this movement were finally able to eat at the white counter in July. So continuing with the theme of education, on November 14, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby Ridges was escorted by 4 armed federal marshals to William Frantz Elementary School for her first day of school. That day, just because of her presence, over 500 children were pulled out of class because their white parents didn't want their children to interact with Ruby. She was kept in the principal's office the whole day. The day after that, almost nobody came to school. She had one-on-one lessons with a teacher who came from Boston to teach her. The kids who remained, the kids who weren't taken out of school by their racist parents, were hidden from her because parents complained to the principal and they didn't want their kids to play with Ruby. Ruby never understood what was going on. Her teacher then threatened the principal, saying that she would tell higher authorities because segregation was actually illegal at the time in schools, especially after the Brown case and everything. So the principal allowed for Ruby to secretly play with the white kids. Although she was always under the wings of the 4 marshals, she faced threats and slurs were constantly thrown at her and her mother. She inspired a historical painting by Norman Rockwell called The Problem We All Live With. Also, during that year, a ban was put on segregated bus travel. Putting this to the test, 7 African Americans and 6 white people got on a bus that was headed for New Orleans. They were called Freedom Riders. Their goal, in essence, was to draw the continuing issue of segregation to Kennedy's attention and have him enforce the law. They knew that reactions would be violent, and they wanted that to be proved to President Kennedy. So there were 2 buses that were to travel different distances. The first bus got attacked by chains, brass knuckles, and pistols. White activists who intervened were beaten unconscious. The movement continued regardless. Bus 1 had reached its destination and its passengers could no longer continue because of the trauma they faced. Bus 2 was set for Montgomery. On its way, it was chased out of town. Its tires were slashed and a firebomb was thrown at it. Thankfully, all passengers managed to escape, but their ride was now gone. They faced complications with the bus companies because drivers feared for their lives, but SNCC volunteers came to their rescue and offered them another ride. As they came closer to Montgomery, Alabama police promised security, but the activists got horribly beaten up. Another group came along to take their place, and the trip continued. Newspapers all over the world covered the traumatic violence Freedom Riders went through. This was obviously an inevitable subject for Kennedy, so he sent them 400 marshals for support and protection. The trip was completed, and the point was proven. The Attorney General and Interstate Commerce Commission banned segregation in all interstate travel facilities, including waiting rooms, bathrooms, and lunch counters. In 1962, Black people still faced racism in schools. An Air Force veteran, James Meredith, a Black man, won a federal court case that allowed him to enroll in an all-white university in Mississippi, Ole Miss for short. When he got there, Governor Ross Barnett refused to let him register. Kennedy ordered federal marshals to escort Meredith to the registrar's office. Barnett got really angry and responded with a radio appeal. He said, quote, "I call on every Mississippian to keep his faith and courage. We will never surrender." This enticed thousands of white protesters, and they came to support Barnett. On September 30th, there were riots on campus, which led to 2 deaths. Thousands of soldiers, 200 arrests, and 15 hours stopped the rioters. After that, for months, federal officials accompanied Meredith to school and protected his parents from night riders who shot up their house. Even though most states tried to keep public areas less segregated, some cities in Alabama still had trouble with that. In 1963, Birmingham was a city known for strict enforcement of total segregation, racial violence, and disdain of Black people. There were a total of 18 bombings from 1957 to 1963. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was also the secretary of the SCLC, decided something needed to be done. He wanted to test the power of nonviolence. Martin Luther King Jr., along with other members of the SCLC, came to Birmingham to desegregate it. After multiple peaceful protests, sit-ins, marches on the city hall, and economic boycotts, at one demonstration, King, along with the other activists, were arrested on Good Friday, April 12th. This is where a letter from Birmingham comes from. As King was locked up in a cell, he wrote this letter expressing why him and his comrades were so passionate about ending segregation and allowing for equal rights. His letter advocated for nonviolent civil disobedience. Even after he was released, the demonstrations continued. Seeing as they weren't super effective, he decided to start the Children's Crusades, where kids would skip school and march. People got arrested and many went to jail. On May 3rd, Eugene Connor ordered the police and fire department to set high-pressure water hoses and attack dogs on the youth. The violent tactics against peaceful demonstrators continued for days, causing outrage in the community and gaining national attention. The negative media forced Kennedy to take action, and he demanded for a civil rights bill. So much attention on the civil rights movement angered white supremacists like Brian Dilla Beckwith, who murdered the NAACP secretary Medgar Evers. Later that year in August, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech in front of 250,000 people, white and black.
As the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
2 weeks after that speech, 4 Birmingham girls were killed in a church bombing. This caused a riot, which killed 2 more African Americans. 2 months later, John F. Kennedy was assassinated and Lyndon B. Johnson became president. He passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination because of race, religion, national origin, or gender. This allowed for all citizens to visit all public places. And here are some interesting facts that took place around this time. The 24th Amendment abolished the poll tax, which originally had been instituted in 11 southern states after Reconstruction to make it difficult for poor black people to vote. The KKK continued their murders and killed 3 civil rights workers, and Martin Luther King Jr. won a Nobel Peace Prize. Also, Sidney Poitier won the Best Actor Oscar for his role in a movie called Lilies of the Field. He was the first African American to win the award. And last but not least, on August 10th, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed by Congress. This made literacy tests, poll taxes, and other requirements that were used to restrict black people to vote. It made all of that illegal. On February 21st, 1965, the prominent African American leader Malcom X was assassinated while lecturing at a ballroom in Harlem, New York. His speeches and ideas contributed to the development of black nationalist ideology and the Black Power movement, which I will talk about later. Malcolm X was an activist whose views slightly differed from King's. Malcolm X believed in violence and armed force to stop racial prejudice.
I think I've heard you make speeches. It seemed to me that you were advocating what I would have to describe, I think, as violence to meet the serious injuries that have been done your people, with which I totally agree.
I don't call that violence. I don't in any way encourage black people to go out and initiate acts of aggression indiscriminately against whites. But I do believe that the black man in the United States and any human being, anywhere, is well within his right to do whatever is necessary, by any means necessary, to protect his life and property, especially in a country where the federal government itself has proven that it is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of those human beings.
Meredith, the man who was admitted into the all-white University of Mississippi, planned a 225-mile walk against fear. His plan was short-lived as he got shot and was too injured to continue. King and Stokely Carmichael, who was part of SNCC, decided to pick up what Meredith has started. SNCC members were quite militant and shouted slogans similar to black separatists who followed Malcom X. King didn't necessarily like this, since he vouched for peaceful protesting, and when he tried to change their views, they didn't really agree. This is when the term Black Power came to be, because Carmichael said, quote, "It was time for black people to begin defining their own goals and lead their own organizations." King didn't want him to use the phrase because it would provoke violence and antagonize whites. Carmichael disregarded that and focused on African American pride. Protests and movements continued. MLK started the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was active from 1965 to 1966. In 1965, there were a series of demonstrations that lasted from March 7th to March 21st. On Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, state troopers violently attacked 600 peaceful demonstrators led by King as they tried to cross the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. 50 marchers were hospitalized after the police used tear gas, whips, and clubs against them. The march is considered a catalyst for pushing through the Voting Rights Act 5 months later. On March 9th, King tried yet again. He led more than 2,000 marchers to the Pettus Bridge, where they encountered a huge amount of state troopers. King had his followers kneel down and pray, and then they all turned back. The attention that this drew from the media prompted President Johnson to introduce voting rights legislation on March 15th, and on March 21st, King once again led a group of marchers out of Selma. This time, though, they were protected by Alabama National Guardsmen, federal marshals, and FBI agents. Marchers arrived in Montgomery on March 25th, where King addressed the crowd with his "How long, not long" speech. In 1966, Black Panthers were formed to fight police brutality in the ghetto. This party advocated for self-sufficiency in African American communities. They wore black leather jackets, black berets, and sunglasses. They preached self-defense and sold copies of the writings of Mao Zedong. They established daycares, free breakfast programs, free medical clinics, assistance to the homeless, and other services in the ghetto.
Number 9, we want all black people when brought to court to be tried by a jury of their peers or people from their black communities as defined in the Constitution. Number 10, we want land, justice, housing, education, clothing, and peace. And as a major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the black colonies of America, in which only black people will participate to decide or determine the will of black people as to their national destiny.
Right on, brother. Right on. Right on.
On June 12, 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the prohibition of interracial marriage was unconstitutional in the case of Loving versus Virginia. The case was decided 9 years after a white man called Richard Loving and Mildred Jeter, a woman of mixed African American and Native American descent, had pleaded guilty to violating the Virginia state law, which didn't allow for a white person and a colored person to leave the state, get married, and come back to Virginia and live as husband and wife. Their 1-year prison sentence was suspended on the condition that they leave Virginia and don't return as husband and wife for 25 years. Once they settled in Washington, D.C., they filed a suit in a Virginia state court in 1963. The case made its way to the Supreme Court, which reversed their conviction. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote for a unanimous court that the freedom to marry was a basic civil right, and denying that freedom was to, quote, deprive all the state citizen of liberty without due process of law. So basically, the ruling then invalidated laws against interracial marriage in Virginia and 15 other states. So moving on, in the next couple of months, on October 2nd, 1967, Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court, and he became the very first Black Supreme Court justice. So this is coming towards the end of the civil rights movement. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was sadly assassinated on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee. James Earl Ray was convicted of the murder in 1969, a year after, but that is still debatable or debated on today because MLK's kids say that James Earl Ray didn't commit the assassination. And lastly, on April 11th, 1968, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, providing equal housing opportunity regardless of race, religion, or national origin. The great people who put endless hours of dedication into the civil rights movement will be honored for the rest of our days. They created thousands of opportunities for mainly Black people in the United States. In my opinion, racial equality has not been reached in the United States. Sure, African Americans have the same written rights as white people, but white privilege will always be there. African Americans live their lives in fear every single day, being frightened and traumatized by what they see on the news every single day. The work didn't end in 1968. There is far much more to be done, but still, we owe it to those who fought for innocent lives and gave Black people a fairer shot at life.
Stop.
I wasn't fighting, bro. I wasn't fighting.
Job, bro. Stop, bro. Stop, bro. What's your password? What's your... Stop, Josh, stop. Stop, bro. Stop, Josh, stop. Stop hitting him, bro. Just stop. Okay, sir, he gonna stop. Josh, stop.
Why would a police officer assume that you did something bad?
Maybe because of my skin color.
I got tased that time. That time they tased me because they said I wasn't complying.
Ariel, are you okay?
What's wrong, baby?
Please, man. Please, somebody help me.
Well, you got him down, man. Let him breathe, at least, man.
I can't breathe.
I've been trying to hear about this. So you breathe a little bit more. What the hell you neck, man? One of my homies died. You in the back of the police car.
I'm about to die, just say.
Relax.
Man, I can't breathe in my face. Just get up.
What do you want?
I can't breathe. Please, the knee in my neck. I can't breathe shit.
Bro, get in the car, man.
I will.
Get up, get in the car.
I can't move.
I've been waiting the whole thing, man. Get up, get in the car.
Mama.
Get up and get in the car right.
I can't.
I gave y'all the opportunity to get in, bro. I told you can't win.
My knee.
You can't
my neck.
win, man.
I'm through.
I know you in there, but you didn't listen.
That's the food. My stomach hurts. My neck hurts. Everything hurts. This water. My face is gone. I can't breathe, man. Please. Please let me stand. Please, man, I can't breathe.